wanted to talk about this notion of climate change mitigation, but applying it specifically to agriculture and forestry landscapes. I thought I'd say a few words first about what CCAFS is. It's the Climate Change, Agriculture and Food Security Research Program of a very large research consortium around the world, consisting of 15 different centers, and it has three main components: looking at adaptation to climate change, the risk management associated with extreme events of climate change, and climate change mitigation itself. And for those of you who don't know, the mitigation component of this large $40 to $50 million program is housed right here in Gunden City. So it's a distributed program across many different institutions around the world. We have a regional approach. We work in 5 regions globally. They're all in the tropics and countries. These are the 3 that we initiated. So what are the elements of the mitigation component? And then I'll get into the real fun part of the discussion, but I thought you should know what it is that we've been doing and what we're supporting in the broad scheme of things. We have about 40 different projects, and they break down into 3 objectives. The first is really just to look at agricultural development generally and how we can reduce the emissions associated with it. So the notion here is that mitigation should not drive agriculture. Agricultural development should drive agriculture, but as we're doing that, let's at least lower the emissions to the extent we possibly can without trading off food or livelihood impacts. The second general area in which we work is then to develop the institutions and incentives that make that possible, and that's what I'm going to focus on today. And the last is really the technical component, where we're trying to generate the data and the methods to quantify mitigation in agriculture. So those are the 3 general objectives of the program. What I want to turn to now is the problem that underlies all of that, and the problem that underlies why we're interested in landscapes. As I think most of the people in this room know, we're probably facing a future where we have to double food production by 2050. We also know that we have a limited amount of new land in order to do that. Probably about the size of California, 445 million hectares. Not a lot of new land to cultivate. And that's been the strategy in the past, of course, for expanding agriculture production. So the question that is in front of us is, how can farmers now intensify agricultural production on smaller and smaller amounts of land while still maintaining food production, the environmental goods, their livelihood, and hopefully reducing climate? We're adding another layer of constraints to things that were already somewhat tough for farmers to do. So what I wanted to do today is to argue that we really should be looking in an integrated way across agriculture and forestry at this landscape scale. And that's what I mean by landscape, is really that we're looking at mosaics of agriculture and forestry, and probably some other land uses along the way, but I'm going to focus on those 2 right now. I'm going to give a little bit of background on the technical aspects of mitigation on agriculture, forestry, landscapes. And then I'm going to talk about one project primarily that we've been engaged in the last 2.5 years, and I'm going to conclude with mentioning a few other projects. So I don't know how many of you have seen this. It's a little bit complicated to put up in a presentation like this, but I really like it because it gives you the whole picture of emissions. And we've focused in the last, 15, 20 years a lot on the energy, industry, and transport sector. And since the Bali COP meeting, since about 2005, more on the AFLU sector, agriculture, forestry, and land use change. These 2, the land use change being mostly deforestation, and agriculture being emissions of methane and nitrous oxide. And what's nice about this picture is it shows you that the forestry picture, avoided deforestation, is mostly about carbon dioxide and reducing carbon dioxide emissions by avoiding deforestation. Right, if we're thinking about mitigation options. And agriculture yields methane, but doesn't have a lot of impact on CO2. And so if we're interested in mitigating in agriculture, then we're really talking about reducing the amount of emissions, not about, we're reducing the emissions. And then we also have something that's not reflected here, which is a strategy of sequestering carbon in the soil, right? Or sequestering carbon in the above ground biomass, which would be basically adding more forest. Okay? So this is just the emissions picture. I would have to have another diagram up here to talk about the mitigation picture. So in terms of a vision then for what a landscape that is reducing emissions, sequestering soil, carbon, in the soil and forest and intensifying agriculture might look like. Here you have your forest, here you have your agriculture. We'd want to increase as much soil carbon storage as possible in our trees, on the landscape, in our forests, in our grasslands, as well as in our soils. Okay. Then we want to make sure that we're both intensifying in sustainable ways, which I mean mostly here to reduce our dependence on inputs as well as reduce the external negative impacts of agriculture. And we want to reduce the amount of greenhouse gases we're producing per kilogram of food. Okay, so we're intensifying in sustainable ways, and I include in that we're reducing our greenhouse gases per kilogram of food. And hopefully we're doing all of that in a way that is yielding these three things that we're really interested in, which is the food security, livelihoods, and then the mitigation and sustainability, environmental component of that. So that's the ideal. And you know, if you think about it, this is a classic forest boundary in agriculture. I'm going to go over some of the reasons why this ideal doesn't work, but that's more or less what we're shooting for. So the question is, you know, if we can just improve this agriculture technically and make it as productive as possible so that the pressure on the forest is less, will that do the trick? Well, I think most of you know, no. You know, the answer is absolutely no. At a broad scale, you know, it probably does work. So Judith Burney published a very widely circulated paper a couple of years ago showing that since the Green Revolution, over about a 40-year period, we've been able to save forest area probably equivalent to about 161 gigatons of carbon, which is very significant. It works out to about half of our current emissions in agriculture annually. So that was based on improvements in the intensity of agricultural production. But when you look more closely, there have been a couple of other studies that have shown the actual increase, you know, where crop yields increased were not the same places where area in the forest was saved. In other words, people expanded, but it didn't necessarily conserve forests in those specific places. And we even find during that period that non-staple crops, tea, coffee, sugarcane, increased. So there's not a direct relationship between food production and forest conservation necessarily at a local level. And we know that intensification often leads to expansion, actually, because you have increased efficiency and there's a lot of incentive because your costs are reduced to keep expanding into the forest if you have an open demand. And in the long run, the emissions from agriculture, so if we go back to that diagram, you know, all the little funny arrows, the emissions from agriculture are going to increase incrementally every year. Right? You can store your carbon one time, but the emissions from agriculture will continue to increase. So if you intensify agriculture, you're basically locking in to an upward trajectory of emissions. Okay, so we know that intensification is not enough, but we also know that we've had all kinds of efforts over the last 50 years to try to stop farmers from going into forests, right? Many, many different ways. So we have, you know, in the early 1960s, it was bring the green revolution to shifting cultivators. And then we had this huge multi-year project that's actually still going on called Alternatives to Slash and Burn. There's a lot of focus in these years on the farmers who were cutting forests, burning them. And then we've had, you know, a lot of people here have been involved in protective area management or ICDPs. And if you look at those projects overall, you know, what's the problem in terms of agriculture and forestry? Most of them are not linking the incentive to intensify agriculture to any incentive to conserve the forest. So that's one thing. You're just dealing with agriculture and then they're dealing with forestry. You might be planting trees and you're planting maybe improved maize, but there's no relationship between these two things. The second is that a lot of them are dealing with just the proximate farmer and not with the prices and the incentives and the policies that are causing either interactions between the farmer and loggers or the road to be built that allows farmers to settle, so they're not looking at the larger macro level factors. And the last is just that these projects tend to be very, you know, small, defined, geographically specific places near forests that are focused just on these technical solutions. So they're not looking at a bigger picture. So what I want to propose and argue is that what we really need is to take this larger governance perspective and not just a technical intensification perspective, and to look at this larger landscape. And to look at it in terms of 4 factors. First, to recognize that we've got to have a multi-scale nested approach, including production value chains, so that we're not just dealing with those local small technical issues. We've got to be looking at combinations of incentives, institutions, and information, not just one or the other. We want to be looking at private sector governance, in other words, how the industry itself is regulating itself, and not just public sector governance. And finally, we want there to be political will, both in the agriculture and environment sectors. So these are the sort of four aspects that I'm now going to expand a little bit upon with this project that we engaged in. So the project is a collaboration, as all of the CCAPS projects are, with University of Michigan, specifically Avron Agarwal and Lauren Pershaw, who was there at the time, and Pete Newton, who's now replaced her. These two guys are postdocs, and then myself in a very, very minuscule way. And our purpose is just very fundamentally to improve those things I just talked about, the governance of agriculture forestry landscapes for these multiple outcomes. So we're really interested in the, not just, I put down forest and livelihood here, but we're also interested in climate and food production. So we've got a multi-dimensional set of outcomes, and we want to know how we can improve these incentives, information, and institutions so that we can get better outcomes. Two main activities. We had a first phase and a second phase. Our first phase was really just reviewing what's out there, what we understand, and doing a meta-analysis and commissioning some papers to do that. And the second phase we're just moving into now, which will be an action research phase in Brazil and Indonesia. So the first phase, just to review some of the findings, as I said, we did a meta-analysis and we commissioned some papers. So the results of the meta-analysis, we looked at 400 studies, but it's surprising how few allow you to look at the intervention and the outcomes in any systematic way. So when you write a paper, please talk about what your X and your Y are, so that people can analyze them a little bit. So we analyzed 123 studies, and there are really only two conclusions that we could draw out of this, which is interesting in and of itself. The first was that local projects tended to have more success in terms of outcomes than large, ambitious policies. And we think there might be a bias in this because the people writing up these kinds of studies, if you're writing up a project, you are often part of a project and you might be promoting it. And if you're writing up a policy intervention, you're often critiquing policy. I know that this is our interpretation of this. So this may be more reflective of the means of the analysis of the articles themselves. But it also means that you have more direct control over your outcomes. The second is really clearly we saw an impact of enforcement, and just more effective enforcement, whether that's land tenure, land use patterns, or forest conservation rules, led to better outcomes. So that's a little bit counterintuitive to a lot of the sort of literature on institutions and community organization and so on. But it's a component, but it's not the only thing. But we found that reinforced by some of our other findings. So we also looked at the commercial sector, and we tried to understand to what extent sustainability initiatives were being undertaken by corporate social responsibility projects. And some of the things that we found in terms of the sustainability initiatives were, well, there are 4 or 5 crops that really matter, right? Oil palm, rubber, soybean, livestock, cocoa. But what's really interesting to me, and this may not really matter for any other purpose, but they tend to be geographically kind of focused. So you find most of the oil palm in Indonesia, most of the livestock in Brazil, most of the cocoa in Ghana and Côte d'Ivoire. These things move. They might move over time, but they move in what do I want to say, concentrated ways. So the corporate sector is just getting in, and I think there might be economies of scale associated with that and so on. So the nice thing is that it allows us to think about an intervention associated in a given place in a little bit more of a focused way. The other point is that, this is kind of obvious, but the sustainability initiatives that we did find were driven by either consumer demand, advocacy, especially Greenpeace, if you want to give to a charity anywhere to do this sort of thing, and public relations concerns. So people were not initiating this generally out of their own values per se. They were really being driven by external forces.
Is there a difference between consumer demand and public relations?
Not necessarily. Yeah, they're related, but there are certainly direct consumer demand sometimes, and then I'd say more general, trying to maintain public relations through trying to do what's seen as general consumer values. Yeah. Then most of these initiatives are developing their own voluntary standards, so there's no strong accountability. They tend to be uneven, and the metrics being used to assess the corporate sector they're very uneven, not very well enforced. So some of the conclusions that we drew from this were, again, echoing what I said before, the need for policy measures affecting these corporate initiatives to be multi-scale, so enforced at the local level, enforced at the national level, enforced at the industry scale, enforced in the production supply chain. That again, there needs to be this combination of information, incentives, and institutions. That it's not one or the other. And that one reason why we need this is because you often need the enabling conditions for one of the other incentives, or for the other piece of information, or for the other institution, and I'll explain that in a second. So again, it's this composite approach that we're getting at. All right, so this was the result of, again, phase one, our basic review of findings. In phase one, we also commissioned these papers I mentioned, and one of the papers was focused on, I'm just going to mention highlights from two of the papers because I think they're interesting. This one reinforces the enforcement finding. This one was done in Brazil, comparing two different institutional approaches. One would be payments for ecosystem services, so more of a market-driven approach, versus enforcement, more of a top-down, so carrot or stick. And they did an economic analysis, and they found, looking at these different cells across Brazil, that if you analyzed where the returns worked, actually I should leave that up there, that you had lower cost pests here and higher cost pests on the fringes, and that the total cost would be about $9 billion. So about 50% of the forest would be eligible for a reasonably efficient pest scheme, but it would be very expensive. So if you took an enforcement approach, on the other hand, and you looked at the costs of enforcement, and sorry, these are not the costs of enforcement, this is where enforcement would be most likely effective. No, sorry, I'm getting it confused. Where the costs of enforcement occur. Net revenue, I'll skip that part. It only costs $2.5 billion. It's cheaper to enforce than it is to do the pests. All right. So the basic lesson from that is that enforcement is cheaper. The other observation from that study was that the institutional conditions that would be required for payments for ecosystem services scheme don't really exist in many of the places in Brazil where they would be implementing it, in terms of land tenure specifically. So the other study that I wanted to mention was done in Southeast Asia, where there's a rubber boom happening, and has been happening for the last 20 years. It's kind of a quiet rubber boom. A lot of people don't know about it. It's happening in some of the more remote areas of Laos in particular, and Thailand, and even southern China. The red areas are the old rubber, and the blue areas are the new rubber. And the most interesting thing from this study was it really questioned, as red is moving into this part of the world, it questioned our definitions of forest and agriculture. Questioned them in terms of swidden being considered agriculture and rubber being considered forest. Is rubber forest, or is rubber agriculture? Is another question. And it questioned them in terms of, over time, these systems are cycling where, 50 years ago this was all forest, then it became rubber, and some of it is now becoming rubber swidden. So how do you judge, you can't just draw a line, as I showed you in that earlier diagram that says, this has to be maintained as forest and this is agriculture. All right. So the most important thing here is just to remember that the boundary on the landscape between a forest and agriculture is somewhat artificial and can be very ephemeral, transient. And in fact, we don't use the term frontier, agriculture, forest, frontier anymore. We use the term just agriculture, forest, landscapes. Okay, so the three main conclusions from phase one, remember, were that we, let's see, the thing about the policy level and the projects, the thing about enforcement, that we know that the enforcement, again, in Brazil was more cost-effective than payments for ecosystem services, and that last point about the boundaries between agriculture and forestry. So we have some scattered principles, but nothing really coherent. So we said, okay, we've got to dig into this a little bit more deeply. Maybe we can't even find any good relationships. With single things, maybe we have to go to that composite picture. So we tried to put it all together, and we have a framework. And this is in the paper that was circulated, so I don't expect people to really see this. But the main points, I think, are important. And that's, first of all, that we've got to be paying attention to the whole food or production supply chain. So from the consumer through to the producer. That we're considering these institutions, incentives, and information. And then we've got some other actors that help out along the way. That examples of some of the initiatives that work in these three categories, or that are being tried, for instance, at the producer level, for instance, we're hoping that RED will support farmers not to convert forest. Right? That's the link there. Another example would be we have a moratorium on logging, or we have I don't know why that's at the processor packager level, it must be something else. Standards for the producers to meet, for instance, in livestock, that in Brazil the Roundtable on Sustainable Livestock is now including not deforesting as one of their standards. Another example would be a boycott against products. There is an oil palm, Greenpeace launched an initiative to stop oil palm going into forests in Indonesia that was very, very effective. So there are a variety of different initiatives that you can map out here, and then you can start to look at the relationships among them and how they reinforce each other. And so, for instance, RED requires land tenure, it requires forest policy, it requires cross-sectoral coordination, and we can start to put little, maybe, I don't know, green lights or something across the ones that work for a particular intervention. And our goal is to try to do this kind of mapping out for selected interventions globally. In fact, anywhere where there's RED and agriculture, we're trying to identify all of those projects globally, map this out, and see if there are any patterns. Again, we suspect that they're going to be rather complex and composite and very, very context dependent, but we want to see if there's a pattern. We've got a couple of general hypotheses that we're testing that are pretty obvious. But for instance, what we're seeing, and this is really bottom up, looking at examples of what's been done, is that market actors are going to act really, really quickly if they see any threats to their sales or reputations, and they have a lot of influence. The people who are at the end of the market chain, the retailers especially, will have a lot of influence back down to their producers, pressure all throughout the market chain. So that can be very quick. In terms of leverage, targeting actors that have a large impact on the entire sector. So in oil palm, there are a few producers that are really enormous. GAR, which is Golden Agricultural something, in Indonesia is the second largest producer of oil palm in the world. So when Greenpeace needed to target an oil palm company, they targeted GAR, and they had a lot of leverage on the impact. And then finally, it seems that if you target at the producer level, that you're likely to have longer term impacts because you're actually changing the behavior of the persons closest to the ground. So we're still working these out. These are thoughts in progress about what to test. But the idea is, again, to try to improve the governance and identify the best ways to do that. So the places that we're going to go to in the next couple of months are in Kalimantan in Indonesia and in the Amazon. We're still working out exactly where in the Amazon. And we're going to work with with our partners here, with GAR, actually the oil palm company that I just mentioned, to help them set up monitoring of their outcomes. And we know the institutional arrangements that they've set up. In this case, they have multi-levels, and they've got their own policy, they've got a national policy, they've got a district policy. And we want to try to map out how these things are actually influencing their outcomes, so to dig down a little bit deeper. So just to summarize, where we are with all of that, and then I'll mention just in closing some of the other CCAPS projects at the landscape level. we know that technical intensification works at the global scale to spare land, but really locally, we've got to look at some of these more institutional strategies. That forest conservation and carbon storage in forests is a one-time solution, but over the longer run, we've also got to be looking at reducing the emissions from agriculture. These composite approaches that I mentioned, both in terms of linking forestry and agriculture, those 3 I's, going up and down the supply chain, and creating enabling conditions across different institutional interventions. And that we're really seeing as a strategic move right now, the focus on commodity supply chains in forest areas as a place that a little bit of effort could probably result in a lot of impact. So 3 final projects that I just wanted to mention so that you know sort of the scope of what we're doing. We've got a very technical project looking at a protocol for the quantification of greenhouse gases in smallholder landscapes, both at the whole farm and landscape level. We're doing that in Western Kenya and in the Philippines, and a little bit in Vietnam. We're also doing some modeling of what mitigation priorities should be at a landscape level. And finally, this is one of my most favorite, is we're looking at what happens as coffee systems adapt to changing climates by moving up the landscape, in especially the Andean countries, and how that affects pressure on the forests and mitigation. So that is it.
I wanted to ask the details of that Brazilian case in which paying for services was less expensive, more expensive than enforcement.
Yeah. I can send you the paper. I may not know the
Okay,
details,
but I guess one conclusion from that is that we're underpricing ecosystem services, because if we paid more, maybe we'd be more likely. Or maybe another conclusion is we know from lots of other energy-related scenes that people don't invest even in things that pay back fantastically, and so that enforcement always is better. End of story. Thoughts?
Yeah, I think we could probably hypothesize endlessly and have to look at the paper. I'm sure they made all kinds of assumptions that, that would factor into this. Let me just look at it.
Enforcement may also be under
Valued.
That a lot of people in the Amazon will break the law, get fined, and be able to pay the fine. It's not, it's cheaper because it's not high enough. You know what I mean?
But if ecosystem services were undervalued, that would imply higher payments, not lower payments. So
It'd be more expensive.
Because it'd be more expensive.
But for an incentive system.
Pay people.
Because payments for ecosystem services, you're paying them to protect ecosystem services.
Right.
If you pay them more, it costs more.
Sure.
Right.
So you're saying
All right, but the fact that it's not effective.
No, but you're saying just what's cheaper. She didn't say what's more effective. She said what's cheaper to achieve the same goal.
The same goal of effectiveness.
Yeah. Because by law, enforcing Brazilian law, you have to preserve well over 80% of the Amazon.
Yeah.
I don't know about the paper, but law enforcement in Brazil is kind of complicated. We have this Brazilian code, the first code that since I was born, and nobody since then that have been done under this law, and especially in Amazon. I don't think it's quite complicated, law enforcement in Amazon, besides the cultural side of the law enforcement in Brazil. So for me, it's hard to accept.
Yeah, your point is very well taken. I think that's the limiting factor in most forest areas globally, is the lack of the difficulty of enforcement. This study was done by modelers, by economic modelers, and they were just looking at, sorry guys.
Oh, this is theoretical, not actual?
Yes. Yeah, it's just a GIS type of spatial analysis where they applied some assumptions and then some numbers and.
And it has to be like a map of the opportunity costs, right? Like how much would you pay them to not convert forest? That's a map of opportunity costs. Okay.
Yes, exactly, willingness to pay.
And the enforcement was also theoretical?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
But any PES system would have to have enforcement with it. So there'd be enforcement costs too for that one. So that's another reason why it would be higher.
And so the question is, even if you could pay for the enforcement, would it be, your point is it may not be feasible. I mean, you could have the policy, you could have the incentives, but if you don't have the actual ability to enforce it, it may not happen.
Yes, and I think that's a problem. And I also know that in Brazil we have like, no, people is willing to do what it takes if they believe that makes sense. And I don't, these areas in Amazon probably make like the most $50 per hectare per year. So I don't think how could be so expensive payments for ecosystem sales, because the productivity is just as bad as you can imagine. Some place they just put cows there to keep the land as a asset for big corporations. It's not just the case of the beef production. So this land is really, most of them produce less than, the rentability I think is less than $20, $50 per hectare per year.
I'm not surprised, and my guess is that's why a lot of these areas were so cheap
Yes.
to pay people for. Yeah. And probably why these areas were less
Yeah.
expensive. One of the reasons.
Yeah, I had a question about that type of landscape, the non-tree plantation side of agriculture. And about, you talked about the leverage that is available to use against, say oil palm, these large. And I'm just wondering, is there an analog in that kind of agriculture? Are there analogous commodities to which leverage can be applied?
And are you thinking in smallholder agriculture?
Well, because that's what I think of, but I'm thinking that smallholder is more subsistence agriculture.
Right.
So I'm wondering if there is
Yeah.
analogous crop.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. There's certainly grain crops that are shared widely, right? And obviously rice, maize, wheat. But and millet, sorghum. And we're looking at a couple of cases of red where we just have subsistence farmers, not major commodity crops, and we're trying to see whether there are incentives that are quite different. I mean, obviously they'll be different for those groups. But I don't think you have that same advantage and efficiency of dealing with one producer and one major supply chain.
So you were talking, that narrative was one that Jason Clay sort of opened his discussion with, and why they need to move quickly and work with some big players. And I was wondering what you thought about that intervention, and going back to your speed, leverage, permanence. It sounds like, the leverage makes sense, that we want to have leverage with big producers, maybe with the GARs, but then how does that counter with the idea of targeting producers, which, as we just said, in some cases are small producers, and it seems like the big players are intermediate or larger scale. And is the World Wildlife Fund's effort like one of those interventions you might look at in a study?
Right. Well, and in fact, we're collaborating with them. So there were definitely, of one mind in terms of the priorities and the need for looking at those interventions. I think you always, well, not always, but you're starting with your priorities where you're going to have the most bang for the buck, and the biggest bang for the buck seems to be through the big producers, as a way of simplifying the picture now. And then we should be looking at the smallholders for the long run, because the numbers are just much bigger.
So the big producers as opposed to the big intermediate companies, he seemed to be targeting folks that purchase from producers.
Right. Both. I think because you could be looking at your Unilevers. On the one hand, we're buying from all the oil palm producers around the world, and then you look at your GARs, who are the producers of the oil palm, and you get both sides.
Yeah, it just seemed like all those approaches would show up in that chart you had, and I was wondering how it could fit in, but it sounds like if you're working with them, you will be looking at their intervention.
Yeah, so I didn't go into it. I think I just briefly touched on the notion that we want to look at we want to do the scoping of all the projects globally. And we started with that a year ago, and theirs was one of the projects that we looked at. And then we've come back to them and we've said, could we collaborate with you? But some projects are more interested in collaboration than others, as you know, in this participatory action research stuff. So they're not ready to do that. But we're hoping that we'll pick them up as part of this larger scoping. Tracy.
Cecilia actually and I were on the same
Okay.
path. Yeah.
Sorry, Ted, one.
Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. Go ahead.
I've got two questions. One is related to an article published by Common Dreams this week about the approaching tipping point of the permafrost with the pending methane release, and the thought that when that hits, we're going to be seeing climate change like nobody has imagined, and that's going to happen pretty soon. So I'm thinking about the institutional response. When you're doing research like this, you're still very dependent upon relative climate stability. Even though you're seeing a lot of change, it's stable compared to what we're going to see. So there's a thought about that. And the other question I have is about the relative role of profit as against the twin motivations of social well-being and personal well-being.
That's interesting. So on the tipping point, was it last year or 18 months ago or so, they reported news that the methane from the permafrost had a much larger plume than they'd ever seen before. So it's already happening.
Yes.
And they've also reported this year that, you know, just last week they see climate change impacts on the ocean rise happening faster than they think. I mean, everything's happening faster than we think. So
Everything's
that
accelerating.
tipping point might be,
We've hit
I
it.
don't know whether it can be formally called a tipping point at this point, but we're certainly there with what we think is happening in the Arctic and the Antarctic, at least in the oceans. It hasn't, well, and certainly we see changes on farmers, you know, the extreme events, and we can see changes in temperature. We're pretty sure are climate related.
So I'm wondering about your institutional response, you as researchers and the things that you're proposing for other institutions.
Yeah, so this is a horrible thing to say, but my colleagues deal with that. So the mitigation component has to deal with adaptation also, but we have a whole other part of CCAPS that is looking at adaptation responses and considering short-term change as well as long-term change that might be necessary. But you know, I would say is you're asking us to consider that our work might be too slow for some of the things that are going to be happening, and I would agree.
And in fact, that there's question about the survivability of all academic institutions and researchers.
Well, that's another, yeah, that's another whole point, yeah. On the other hand, you know, this is an investment
Public
into
is
the longer run.
so don't worry about
We do what we can. In the meantime, what about the
Profit.
motivations of profit versus people doing things because it's the right thing and it's healthy for the planet and each other?
Yeah, so I kind of use livelihoods as a way of capturing not just profit, but how people want to live. And we often reduce livelihoods back down to an income indicator, but I purposefully use livelihoods to try to capture something a little bit more multidimensional.
So do you have a sense of the relative role? I mean, I think corporations are pursuing profit, and it just bugs me because I would like to see like a triple bottom line or something like that kind of approach.
Yeah, I think we see more and more public entities taking a triple bottom line approach, and I think there's a genuine shift happening where more and more funds are being used to support that resources. Yeah. Let me go on.
So I'd love to hear you talk more about how you're actually going to measure outcomes in the oil palm and Brazilian cattle thing. So you said in your literature review that very few studies actually match the X's and Y's and show like the intervention and its effect on both forest and livelihoods and things. So can you just talk a little bit more about the design of the studies in those two places, and is that the goal, to try to do in those studies what you found so rarely done in your literature review?
Short answer to the last part, yes.
Yeah.
The studies, part of what the challenge is how to design it, because most monitoring dies after a few years. People don't, invest in monitoring because it's expensive and tedious and kind of pain. So we're trying to identify very cost-effective ways of monitoring that build on existing systems across these institutional frameworks. So who's already monitoring and cells, so to speak. And we're definitely going to rely on some remote sensing. The basic indicators would be forest cover, probably food yields, and the number of farmers involved. We have some qualifying things, but probably food yields, forest cover, and then we haven't figured out how to look at the emissions in any kind of a simple way, because that's very complicated. And as I said, the goal would be to help them set up some kind of a system that is cost effective and reduced. Yes,
Well, I'm wondering, sort of on a big picture scale, is what your opinion is about the commodity boom. is whether or not climate change was more easily mitigated when commodities had literally no value at all, and all the smallholder farmers were complaining that we're being paid below the cost of production. I remember, this was a concern for more than 20 years, versus now where the payment costs for commodities are much better, but then you have this sort of treasure impulse where people are going in and developing, lands which perhaps were better left. Can you weigh the difference between whether climate change was increasing more under sort of the slash and burn when they were really doing the cheap commodity stuff versus now when commodities are more expensive?
Right. So the impact of agriculture on climate change is really in the future. It's expected to be much higher in the future. You saw in that first diagram that I showed that agriculture is only 10 to 14%. And of that agriculture, about half of it is from nitrous oxide in the soil and half of it is from livestock, not necessarily shifting cultivation. And I think the Stern report showed that shifting cultivation is only something like 1% of the land area that they were concerned about with regards to deforestation. So that's now, mind you, or 2005 or something. But so I guess the point I'm trying to make is that we're really looking at the increase in agriculture going forward and the conversion of land and the intensification of agriculture going forward as where the bigger impacts are going to happen.
So there really historically over the last 20 years you didn't see a change in land use that had an impact on climate change between low commodity prices and high commodity prices?
Oh, certainly. And I can pull up, you can see the commodity, I've got it down here, just the trends in all the commodities over the last 20 years. You can see let's take a second. You can see really, except for cattle, which have been pretty consistent, you can see the increase, and then I should let people go because it's 1 o'clock, that's okay. But for especially palm oil, and so these are what cattle, palm oil, soybean, cocoa, rubber. And this just shows all 3 regions of the world: Africa, Latin America, South Asia. And for instance, palm oil, this is Indonesia. This is Brazil, and cattle is increasing, but not as. You also have to. These units are not comparable across commodities, so that's a huge question. And soybean, you can see an increase.
So this is the increase in carbon as a result. No, this is just the increase, because I was actually asking about if you could mark it, but it doesn't really show up. I'm not talking about the actual commodity production, I'm talking about the increase of CO2 in the atmosphere.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to look at, but for instance, cattle we know have been a historical driver of deforestation, so that's been long term, or at least, I don't know, at least 30 years.
30 years.
Yeah, at least. Palm oil is more recent. So I would say you'd have to look at we certainly have vastly larger numbers of hectares being deforested with commodity expansion than we did with, or than we have had
With
for the same time unit. I mean, you'd have to look at a lot of qualifying factors.
Yeah.
Thanks so much, Lini.
You're welcome. Yes, thank you.